Welcome to the Binary Agora. In this series, we dive deep into the world of legal tech, breaking down its challenges, its innovations, and real-world impact with insights from top researchers, practitioners, and officials. And today's episode is a bit more special to us since it aims to explain and also discuss the recently issued decision published by the European Commission to open a non-compliance procedure against Google under the DMA released on the 13th of November. First, I will briefly outline the main characteristics of the non-compliance procedure's content, and after that, I will discuss alongside Małgorzata Kozak about the broader implications of the case on how news publishers monetize the availability of their online content and also how economics play out in this context. So, Google introduced its site reputation abuse policy in March 2024 to try to combat a practice where third parties post content on highly trusted sites to exploit the website's domain authority for better search rankings. The policy targets third-party content, such as, for instance, sponsored advertising or also partner pages that piggybacks on the host site's reputation, especially when they are produced without close oversight to try to manipulate search traffic. And in essence, it aims to try to demote content that wouldn't rank as high on its own. Examples of such an abuse include news sites hosting third-party white-labeled coupons or also established sites rapidly expanding into new areas, primarily using freelance content. When a violation is determined abiding by this policy, Google applies a manual action forcing the host of that particular website to either exclude the content from the search index, move it to a new domain, or also rewrite it as first-party content. A key shift occurred in November 2024. So initially, the policy introduced in March 2024 focused on third-party content lacking host oversight. However, Google later specified that content created with first-party oversight can still violate its policies, and if the primary goal is to exploit ranking signals. Google, in that sense, found that the degree of host involvement didn't change the fundamental third-party nature of the content if the intent in the end was manipulation. The revised definition describes site reputation abuse also as publishing third-party pages on a site in an attempt to abuse search rankings by, in that sense, taking advantage of the host site's ranking signals, emphasizing that the source of external content from freelancers to white label services count as third parties. And the policy change, particularly in November 2024, caused immediate and significant disruption. Hundreds of publishers, including major sites like CNN underscore, Forbes Advisor, and the USJ buy site, saw their entire shopping and also recommendation sections wiped from Google's search results, leading to major revenue losses, especially around the lucrative Black Friday and Cyber Monday period. Publishers raised concerns that their content was being penalized simply for containing affiliate links or involving legitimate white label content partnerships, which are essential revenue streams for media organizations. The algorithm shift favored niche experts, specialized review sites like Bankrate, and also user-generated content platforms like Reddit, making it harder for generalist publishers to try to monetize commercial content. And this practical effect, publishers alleged, put legitimate media properties at risk of removal. News publishers, in that sense, rely on diverse revenue streams to try to support their journalism. And two key commercial modes challenged by the site reputation abuse policy are affiliate links and also white label content partnerships. On one hand, affiliate link is a unique URL embedded in a publisher's content that allows them to earn a commission every time a reader clicks the link and subsequently purchases a product or service from the merchant's site. For a news publisher, integrating these links into product reviews, best of lists, or shopping guides has become a vital way to try to monetize their high traffic content, especially as traditional display advertising revenue has declined. So the links enable publishers to generate income based on performance, so actual sales, while leveraging also the trust that they have built with their audience. On the other hand, a white label content partnership is a business arrangement where one company, so the producer of that content, creates a product or service, and another company, so the news publisher, rebrands and sells it as their own. In the context of news media, this often involves taking third-party content, such as a specialized financial or also coupon service, and hosting it on the publisher's domain under their own branding. And the main purpose is therefore to offer a ready-made and reputable service to the publisher's audience without the publisher having to build an infrastructure or content from scratch. Google's site reputation abuse policy explicitly targeted this practice when the primary reason for the publisher to host the third-party content is solely to exploit its high domain authority for search rankings, which is what the European Commission is currently examining. The European Commission's non-compliance procedure against Google is specifically assessing whether the implementation of the site reputation abuse policy breaches two critical obligations under the Digital Markets Act. The first is Article 6.5 of the DMA, which generally mandates that a gatekeeper like Google shall not treat more favorably in ranking, indexing, and also crawling services and products offered by the gatekeeper itself than similar services or products of a third party. In that sense, it must also apply transparent, fair, and non-discriminatory conditions to such ranking. Publishers allege that the site's reputation abuse policy, by demoting commercial content and favoring user-generated content or niche specialized sites, may be indirectly tilting the playing field towards Google's own offerings or preferred content types. On the other hand, the second and perhaps the most fundamentally challenged provision is that of Article 612, which requires the gatekeeper to apply fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory general conditions of access for business users to its core platform service. So in this case, the Google search engine. The European Commission's investigation centers on the fairness and non-discriminatory nature of the site reputation abuse policy as a condition of access. Google, however, might argue that the policy is fair because it applies equally to all sites and protects end users from spam. However, the publishers argue that the policy, through its enforcement, unfairly targets their legitimate quality controlled commercial content and thus imposing an unfair condition that threatens their economic viability. The European Commission's focus on this article really signals an attempt to try to give real substance to the DMA's fairness obligations, so moving beyond mere formal compliance. After the brief summary on the underlying rationale of the European Commission's procedure against Google, I'm really glad to introduce Małgorzata Kozak. She's an assistant professor of competition law at Utrecht University, and she has also recently co-founded the Blue Dragon Institute, so a think tank focusing on the legal aspects of the latest technologies, and in particular on the promotion and also of the respect for press freedom and media pluralism. And on this same topic, she's also currently working on a book on media pluralism and EU law. So welcome to the Agora, Małgorzata.
Thank you very much, Alba, for having me. As you know, I'm following your work closely and directly, and I really admire all the hard work and professionalism you are showing. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you for the kind words, Małgorzata. As we were discussing, the European Commission's non-compliance procedure tries to capture Google's site reputation abuse policy, and the regulator will try to investigate whether the gatekeeper's actions will impact publishers' freedom to try to conduct legitimate business, also innovate, and try to cooperate with third-party content providers. Just to start off the conversation, I wanted to ask you whether you could provide a general overview of the different actors involved in providing online news to the public.
This is a very complex issue. I would focus on three perspectives. First, the perspective of information circulation that I think is important to understand in this modern context. I would like to briefly then discuss the market perspective, and then finally how money circulates within the system. There's a deep shift in the news distribution and the way people consume news. And previously it was the scarcity of information. Now we are living in a world of abundance of information, which was named by Professor Brogi as exposure diversity. So it's important how information gets to us. And also what news is also changing. In the digital environment, we discuss content, a mass of different categories of information, whereas the point of war is really about journalistic news, understood as information that have been gathered, researched, sourced, investigated, and verified. And this is also how the Court of Justice defines journalistic news. Coming back to your question to actors, we have traditional news providers, journalists, publishers, news agencies in some countries, etc. Right now, we have also digital intermediaries, mainly Google and Meta, who themselves do not produce any quality contents, but who just direct traffic to press publishers. I think that should resonate with people from Northern Europe. They are like modern Hansa. So Hansa was a middle-age association of cities, and they distributed crop, but they have not produced it. They were just focused on grain trade, transporting it elsewhere. Coming back to news, Reuters digital news reports showed that social media was the main gateway for online news for more than a third of respondents. More than a third part of the audience is using really social media as their source of news. Digitalization and platformization do not just mean that newspapers move their content online for direct access by readers, as a kind of also consequence of this process. Already in 2017, a third of all consumers preferred to access news content directly on websites of press publishers. Two-thirds preferred access via third-party operated algorithm-driven platforms, so news aggregators. And those proportions are changing at the detriment of press publishers. Press publishers are increasingly reliant on digital news aggregators, and that shapes media and news landscape, compelling even large news media businesses to adapt. Digital news aggregators have evolved into real gatekeepers of information, getting back to more economic regulation language. And then market perspective. We have twofold relationship between news publishers and digital platforms. On the one hand, there is a complementary vertical relation between news aggregators and publishers, because the content that publishers create is distributed to platform user bases, and platforms drive back traffic to the publishers. But at the same time, there's of course a horizontal competition between them, as both sides compete for the user's attention and advertising revenue. While internet users might browse their favorite newspaper, website, or app for news, they could also turn to Google News, Facebook, X, etc. And finally, perspective of money. The main source of income for publishers have always been related to advertisement. As I talked about users' choices, similar choices are faced by advertisers. They decide between spending their online advertising budget on news sites or on major platforms. But major platforms have technological edge, and they have this vast databases, which actually leads them to dominate online advertising. We observe a situation close to a duopoly. All those three perspectives are connected through search engines and content moderation. When users search for information, they enter a keyword or a series of keywords, which together make up a query. Once the query is entered, the search engine proposes answers to the query. And with respect to news, it can show standard results, title, the source website, and a text excerpt called snippet. It is also possible that within the result there is a thumbnail image, and those answers are shown similarly on any device of the user, so computer, mobile phone, or a tablet. But there are several issues related to this. One of them is a fair remuneration for those short extracts for snippets that such aggregators show. In 2020, the French authority tried to remedy the situation about the lack of remuneration for snippets through commitments. As a background of this decision, there were legislative changes due to transposition of one of the directives in copyright law, and then Google announced to stop displaying those snippets unless publishers decided or agreed to allow free use of their content. Without snippets, the news looks absolutely less attractive and will not attract as many users to click and to go on a publisher's website. Another example is linked with an existence of an ecosystem, so self-preferencing of aggregators' own services over publishers' websites. In Germany in 2021, Bundeskartellamt opened an investigation into Google News Showcase, which favorized news coming from producers cooperating with Google under this program. These examples are linked with monetization of users' traffic through content moderation. Even small algorithmic changes can drive away traffic from news outlets. For example, in Turkey, there was a news outlet called Duvar, which went bankrupt because of it. This reliance on digital aggregators is the most dangerous for small outlets, local news providers, which are very important for local democracy. The topic which is maybe less relevant for economic governance point of view, but is linked with content moderation, is prioritization of engaging content and disadvantaging political, electoral, social issues. We heard that Meta and Google have stopped advertising on those issues as a reaction to the adoption of political advertisement regulation in the EU. Just to be very clear, these are business decisions. We know that companies are allowed to make their own business decisions. However, contrary to other kinds of industries, information and more specifically quality news or journalistic news are fundamental for the existence of democracy and informed voting decisions.
I was wondering what business model do most news publishers now rely on, bearing in mind these changes, because I was wondering how most of them really produce their revenues. For instance, in the European Commission's non-compliance procedure, it seems that the enforcer is really worried about these affiliate links and partnerships that they come up with to try to monetize their content. So I was wondering whether you had some insights on what the majority does in order to sustain the producing of the journalistic content.
I think there is no single model. This is a trial and error process. They use hybrid business models. They try to combine traditional approaches with new digital strategies. Traditional strategies relied on print circulation, advertising based on vertical integration between production and distribution. Modern strategies use a mix of digital advertising, online subscriptions separated by a paywall and membership. Subscriptions, for instance, are more problematic because only high quality or very specialized newspapers can still attract a reasonable willingness to pay for online content. And paying subscribers constitutes only a small minority. Research already showing that the highest numbers are still around 15% of news readers in Scandinavian countries and less than 5% in Southern and Eastern European countries. I mentioned search engines. Once a user finds an article and let's say they click on it, which also is decreasing because of AI-driven tools, the full articles that readers click will have advertising in places selected by the news publisher. And large share of these advertising slots will be sold through the Google and ad auction market. So Google shares the revenue with news publishers. This is their main source of online advertising revenue. There is a question, of course, how articles are ranked in the search engine, because the higher click-through rates generate more advertising revenue. Both the platform and the news publishers have a commercial interest in pushing trending articles up in the search ranking. But there is a huge imbalance because there is one side who controls all the process and also who has all the information about the numbers. To give you the example of this imbalance, even in the Netherlands, 80% of digital advertising revenue currently goes to big international players like Google and Meta. 80% of the revenue, which of course is very difficult then for publishers to sustain and to build up financial viability. And what we also need to remember about this, we are talking about news. Limitation of print led to decrease of costs, but also had implications for checking the quality and sources of news production. Additionally, there was 24 hours cycle, creating one new edition of newspaper a day. Online news changed this by allowing stories to be written and updated all day long. There is competition also between newspapers, so they cannot wait until the next day to publish breaking news anymore. Everything which is posted online is visible to everyone, including competitors. They watch very carefully each other's websites and quickly copy and follow up on stories and also verify them. This is an aspect of competition which could build up or be used to support quality news. Julia Caget studied how quickly news spread online. On average, it takes about 2 hours for a story posted on one news site to appear on another, but in half of the cases, it spreads in under 45 minutes, and in quarter of cases, it takes less than 5 minutes. Other revenue streams include sponsored content, event donations, grants, and licensing. But the major source is, of course, digital advertising.
Circling back to the DMA's non-compliance procedure seeks to determine whether Google's site reputation abuse policy infringes the self-preferencing prohibition, similar to the type of conduct also captured by the Bundeskartellamt in the case you were talking about earlier. In this case, it would be under Article 6.5 of the DMA. The European Commission also considered that Google in particular should provide its service in frank conditions abiding by the provision under Article 6.12. These frank conditions require them to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory conditions. Would you say that as we stand now, are the news publishers currently fairly remunerated for the efforts that they invest in Google's platform? And in any case, would you highlight any cases that competition authorities have really triggered to try to address this question of fairness in terms of remuneration in exchange for this news?
To the DMA, I am also trying to argue very briefly in my book that gatekeeper obligations could be extended to include the adoption of general conditions of access, including those concerning fair remuneration, maybe in line with Article 6, paragraph 12 DMA, but also transparency obligations, which could be modeled on Article 6, paragraph 10 or 11, because those general conditions could provide for a union-based kind of alternative dispute settlement mechanism that could be easily accessible, impartial, independent, free of charge, but also preventing the abuses of the settlement systems. As we know, transparency is extremely important. Though all those operations are opaque, during the implementation of the Digital Single Market Directive, when it was transferred, for instance, in Poland. In this context, I mentioned the French authorities case, which was linking directly with the implementation of the DSM directive. Why it caused problems? Because in Article 15, it frames the so-called ancillary rights for press publishers, which seeks to reestablish the degree of economic balance between news publishers and online platforms. The directive stipulates that authors must receive an appropriate share of revenues, but it does not define what is appropriate share. And it does not set procedural rules for licensing and remuneration. So in France, national implementation of Article 15 has led to different implementation mechanisms, different transposition and regulatory disputes. In French, authority required Google to engage in fair negotiations with publishers. In Spain, I know that there was proceedings opened by the National Commission on Markets and Competition. In Italy, there was an authority which was designed to enforce the national implementing measures. And in the appeal, there have been already 3 preliminary questions referred to the Court of Justice. In one case, at least, Advocate General Spunar gave his opinion, also recognizing this imbalance. Outside of the EU, there were attempts to regulate this issue by specific regulations. I think the most known is the Australian News Bargaining Code, which was actually adopted to incentivize digital platforms to enter into those commercial deals with news publishers. But a year ago, a new act called News Bargaining Incentive was initiated, as the code was found to have limitations because it allowed platforms to avoid their obligations to remove news, which meant that they didn't fall within the scope. This incentive includes a charge and an offset mechanism. Platforms that choose not to enter or renew commercial agreements with news publishers will pay the charge, and platforms with these agreements will, however, be able to offset their liability. The incentive should apply to large digital platforms operating significant social media or search services, irrespective of whether they carry news or not. So another example is Canada. Canada introduced its Online News Act. When it entered into force in 2023, it resulted in Meta blocking news content in order not to pay for the news. Another example, more related to private enforcement, is that in 2024, in the Netherlands, over 30 European media companies sued Google in a private claim. The most emerging issue now is AI and AI summaries in Google search results. Those summaries can reduce traffic that is directed to press publishers by almost 80%. because people tend to read only those summaries and not go further to check what is really on the website.
All of these competition authorities, regulators decided that this is not a fair share or a fair distribution of effort. And the question that really looms is whether fairness in the DMA, the imbalance between the rights and obligations of business users vis-a-vis the gatekeepers, will still be interpreted as such within the news publisher scenery. So to wrap up the episode, so the European Commission's non-compliance procedure capture Google's conduct in implementing this site reputation abuse policy, because it basically leads news publishers to de-index results from the news publishers ranking within the search services, mainly because they use third-party content, because Google interprets that by those means they free ride on their high quality web pages for commercial purposes by incorporating these affiliate links and white label partnerships. I wanted to ask a broader question of whether the current business model are really going to be sustainable in the long run, or whether alternative business models should be considered instead.
Oh, I think it's a $1 million question, but I'm not sure if I'm in a position to assess business models, but there is a visible change in the actions of publishers. They are really trying to catch up in those markets. So the number of private litigation cases is growing. They also recognize that there are several ways to try to encourage readers to stay within their services. But again, this is easier for the big players. But what is really worrying, it's a situation of small local outlets, crucial for democracy. Also, what is interesting and maybe less discussed is that publishers have also noted growing dependency on technology coming from big tech companies. So there are examples, for instance, of TikTok tracking Financial Times journalists through their phone as a response to the topic that this journalist was working on. Due to the power of platforms, it is really a struggle between David and Goliath. There is a need of regulatory and more coordinated action, and recognizing actually the role of quality news, because news businesses are different than any other businesses. They need more attention from regulators, and then this attention from regulators needs to be balanced with freedom of expression. This is a very complicated matrix related to non-economic interests and fundamental rights. Just to wrap up, maybe, as we are living in the era of abundance of information, the role of gatekeepers really requires scrutiny. So I can only echo here Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility.
Thank you so much, Małgorzata, for all of your insights that you have provided us today, because it really seemed that this non-compliance procedure was a bit difficult to try to navigate through, and your insights really contributed to giving a broader background on what we are talking about and how the European Commission may also analyze that particular market. So thank you for joining us in the Agora.
Thanks.